Our scripture lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 28 through 43. It can be found on page 900 of your pew Bibles if you'd like to follow along. We are in year A of the lectionary cycle, which normally means we read from Matthew's Gospel. Excuse me, but this morning we're switching to read the Transfiguration story from Luke's Gospel. This is one of those stories that's found in all four of our Gospels, and it is also one that is followed by another story. And Luke's transition from one story to the next is a little more smooth than Matthew's might be. So we're going to focus on Luke's Gospel here this morning, both that Transfiguration story and what follows as we read here in the 9th chapter. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and suddenly his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only child. Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. May God's blessing be upon the hearing and the understanding of this holy word. It was about 20 years ago. I was a senior in high school in Beverly, Massachusetts, when my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer. It was hard. We had spent a lot of time together. He, along with my dad, my other grandfather, and I, would often go fishing together on the Ipswich River, trips that would, of course, include a stop at the tobacco shop in Hamilton, where my grandfather would grab a cigar that my grandmother never let him smoke. It's doubtful that's the reason why he came down with lung cancer, an occasional cigar here or there, but that's what he died from. In the end, I knew it was bad, even though he hadn't been diagnosed for long. We weren't allowed to go visit him in the hospital, his choice. But my parents kept telling us that we needed to call him and talk to him. I'm grateful for that now. My last conversation with him ended with him urging me to replace the windshield on my car that had been recently cracked. It was a plain old ordinary conversation, and that's what was so special about it. When he died, I remember my older brother Greg coming to get me out of accounting class. He never picked me up at school, so when I was called to the office and saw him standing there, I knew immediately what had happened. We headed straight to my grandparents' apartment. It was that night, I think, that I penned a poem to my grandfather. It's embarrassing now in its rhyming simplicity and youthful innocence, but I'll set my pride aside because I think it has something to say to our gospel lesson this morning. The poem's called "The Reality of Life." I've known you forever, my long-standing friend. Now our time together has come to an end. Such a tragic fate, how life can be. Happiness and sadness are all a mystery. Why do you have to leave? Why can't you stay? Without you makes for an empty day. I know you'll be going to a better place. It's the reality of life that's so hard to face. Please, Lord, I pray with all of my might, don't ever let him leave your sight. Keep him protected under your wing, until together again us you will bring. Again, apologies for bad poetry, but I do think this has a connection to that lesson we read in Luke's Gospel a moment ago. So recall that scene with me now, if you will. Jesus' transfiguration. It's a wild story. Jesus, Peter, James, John, along with Moses and Elijah up on top of a mountain. Visions, God's voice, clouds, dazzling white clothes, blinding lights. It sounds like a movie just waiting for a Grateful Dead soundtrack. As such, it probably goes without saying that a lot has been said about this story over the years. Some suggest that this was a mystical vision that Jesus had, or a displaced resurrection story, or that it foreshadows Jesus' death on the cross, or simply that it's just too daunting to talk about. I've always taken this story to be Jesus' attempt to show the disciples what he'd been trying to tell them all along about his close relationship with God and what awaited him when his earthly life came to an end. Perhaps it's a little bit of all of these, we'll never know, since neither Jesus nor the 3 disciples who were there talked about it. But we do know that it was important, as this is only one of a handful of stories that all 4 gospel writers cover. Not only that, but all 4 then follow this story up with that story of the young boy who is desperately ill, suggesting that these 2 stories are intended to go together. And because of that, I found myself drawn more to what was happening on the bottom of the mountain than on the top of the mountain as I was reflecting this week. And as such, one word kept jumping out at me: beg. The man had begged the disciples to help him and his son, but they could not, and so he turns to Jesus, begging once again for his child. It's in response to the Father's begging, then, that you'll recall that Jesus comes out with that curious line, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you?" Now, jokingly, we can say that Jesus needed more sleep or another cup of coffee because he's pretty cranky here. But the reality is that this is a line that's hard to understand because it doesn't sound like Jesus. So is he mad at the man, the disciples, everybody? Is this Luke putting words in Jesus' mouth? Well, for me, it makes the most sense to say that Jesus was showing his frustration with the disciples. It's almost as if he was saying, after what I just showed you up on that mountain, and after all that we've been talking about, you still don't get it? And so this then obviously gives rise to the question, so what did he show them up on that mountain? Again, we don't know, but we have Luke's speculation. Jesus was up on a mountain, a traditional site for encounters with God in the Bible, and he was praying. It's then that Peter, James, and John can actually see that Jesus' face and his clothes become changed, transfigured by his time in prayer. Moses and Elijah appear as well. And so to this, Peter suggests that they should build a shrine to commemorate the moment, but no sooner has Peter said those words than does a cloud overshadow the disciples in which God speaks. And when the cloud is gone, the scene before them is gone as well. So what's that saying then? Well, 2 things, I think. First, there's a change that comes over us when we stand in the presence of God, a transfiguration that actually enables those around us to see that something pretty special has taken place. Which leads to our second point. The disciples don't get that. They think that what happens to Jesus is so extraordinary, so unique, that they need to set up a shrine, maybe sell tickets and souvenirs, I don't know, bobblehead transfigured Jesuses maybe, and invite them to come and see where Jesus had this remarkable encounter with God. In so doing, they miss the point that Jesus was trying to show them. This transfiguration isn't reserved for Jesus alone, nor is it a one-time occurrence. It's open to all people anytime they draw close to God. And he shows them this again when he gets to the bottom of the mountain. For remember what he does, he tells that begging child's father to bring him here. In other words, he tells the boy to draw close to God. And when that boy draws near, Jesus heals him from his ailment. In short, in that moment, that boy's life and body is transfigured. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in what was wrong with this boy. Remember that in Jesus' day, people equated illness with demonic possession. Everything from seizure disorders to mental illness was often attributed to it, even though science today teaches us something very different. So I would say that the ailment and the cure really don't matter here. What matters is that this boy was transfigured when he drew close to God. And could that not have been what the Father was begging for? I assume most of us think that the Father was looking for a miracle or a dramatic healing, and maybe that's true, but maybe not. For the Greek word used here means to petition, to beseech, to pray, to make a request, as we might imagine, but it also means to beg, as in to bind oneself to. So could it not be then that the Father was simply asking for Jesus to come close to the child? If so, it would explain why Jesus gets so mad. This Father understands more about Jesus than those disciples do. This Father understands that what his Son needed was to stand close to a God who had the power to transform and transfigure his life. And that's just what happens. The Son draws near, the Son is transformed, and all are astounded at the greatness of God. And you've been there before, right? You've been in that position to beg God, haven't you? Perhaps it was for a few more days on this earth for a loved one. Maybe it was for a certain cancer test not to come back positive. It might have been for your son to be safe on prom night. Maybe it was for your daughter's pregnancy and delivery to go well. Or maybe it was for someone you didn't know, a child in poverty, a woman in Syria, an unknown face in the Ukraine. Think back to such a moment, to a time when you were begging God, and ask yourself the question, what were you begging for? A miracle? A dramatic divine encounter, the result that you wanted to see happen? My guess is that many of us have been in those situations, and we have filled our prayers with the expectations that we have heaped on God, or by telling God exactly what we think that we need or what we think that God needs to do. But I wonder if that's really our role. Is it our job to tell God what to do in those moments as if we know better what should happen than God does? That brings me back to the poem that I wrote for my grandfather. In that poem, I was telling God exactly what I thought I wanted and what I needed. I was begging for my grandfather to live, begging to have the rules of mortality changed. But as I look back on it, what I really needed to ask God for was exactly what I asked God to do for my grandfather. Draw him close and hold on. And as such, it makes me wonder, when life rears its heartbreaking, heart-wrenching head as it does for us all, should we not simply be praying for God to come near with no expectations, just with a firm faith and confidence that God's presence has the power to transfigure us and our lives to get through whatever may come our way in a way that God wants, not in a way that we think we want? Help, I need you, draw close, God. For me, that prayer is what this story is all about. It's telling us that no matter where we're going through, what we're going through in our lives, that's all that needs to be said. A simple prayer begging for God to come close and transfigure us in a way that God knows what we need. And when we do that, I think that what we'll find is that before those words even leave our mouths, we'll know that God is present because God is always present. And what we then receive promises to be nothing short of transformational. Amen. Our communion hymn is in the black hymnal 329.